welcome back to the channel. I know it's been a while. Today we're going to take a look at my new 2021 Trek Slash. I'm not going to do a review on this bike. I gave you guys my first impressions when the bike first came out. We talked about a lot of the features. This is actually going to be just a bike check. I am going to give a lot of my thoughts in terms of how I feel about it, but I've decided not to do a full review. Probably the biggest thing you guys are going to want to know is how tall am I, what size is the bike. This is probably the most asked question of any review I've ever done on any bike. So here's the deal. I am 5'11" and 3/4. I have been riding larges pretty much forever. This time I decided to grab the medium large. So Trek makes a size right between the medium and the large, and this is the first time they've offered it on the Slash. I rode the large, which I gave you guys my first impressions on, and I really did like that bike, but I kept comparing it to my large Fuel EX, and then I kept looking at the geometry numbers, going back and forth, deciding there was things about the Fuel EX that really depended on the fact that it was a slightly smaller reach number, slightly smaller size overall, and the medium large was just closer to the Fuel. And so I looked back and forth and I decided I would grab the medium large, and I've got to say I'm very happy that I did. It fits my style. It's the kind of feel that I want out of a bike. This is not going to apply to everybody, but that's the deal for me. I know you guys are going to ask, so there you go. I'm going to start at the front and work my way back. So major changes I've made on the front. Basically, I've just switched the front tire. I have an Assegai, an Exo Plus Max Grip compound. That's the front tire that I love to run. I've gotten pretty used to over the last couple of years. I put a Jerome Clements Yeti fender on this fork. On the fork, we've got 170 millimeters of travel, 64.1 degree head tube angle. So by far the most aggressive bike I've ever owned in that regard. On the Zeb, I'm running it fairly quick on the rebound. On the air spring, I have 47 PSI. So very different than what you might run on a Lyric or a Fox 36. I'm usually running 10, 15 PSI at least, more than that. And I took the one token it had in it from stock out of the fork. I still have never bottomed it out, but I'm closer now at 47 PSI. On the bars, I basically just changed out the grips. So I always go with a nicer grip. Stock grips feel pretty cheap. And this year I went with the Lizard Skins, the machine grips. They've got our shop logo on them. And I have really liked the ergons, but I wasn't able to get any. And I gotta say, the feel on these is really nice, and I'm enjoying them so far. Of course, we have the Bontrager carbon bar. No intention of changing that, except that it came as an 810 width, which is bananas. And I kept it that way for like one ride. It felt pretty cool, but definitely not something I wanted to live with long term. So I cut it down to 790. I usually run 780 bars, but after running the 810s and kind of being exposed to that, I thought, well, let's leave 5 mil extra on each side. And the 790 has been pretty cool. In the storage compartment, I pretty much use a Tubolito tube because that's the only 29er tube I can find that will fit in there. And I have a tire lever in there, a couple of small tools, and fill the rest with snacks when needed. I have E13's aluminum pedals on this bike. I will probably switch to Deity T-Max in the future. I really, really like these E13s, but these are the pedals that are supposed to be on the Krampus. This bike did come with the MRP bash guard and chain guide. The XT cranks came as 175s. I'm probably gonna swap them out. I've been running 175s forever, but I think 170 is the way to go. I switched to a one-up dropper post. I did the math and I figured out I needed a 180 one-up dropper post to fit for my height and this seat tube length and everything, but I couldn't get one. So I grabbed what was in stock, which was a 210, and I basically shimmed it down to 190, and it actually fits. I can ride this bike all day with this post, but I've got 190 mils of drop, and so I'm pretty stoked on that. The reason I switched it is because the medium large comes with a 150 dropper post, and at my height, that just didn't seem to make sense. I've been running a 170 for the past couple of years, so I didn't want to go backwards, so I went 20 mils longer. Instead, I put on my ergon saddle, which I've owned for a number of years now, and I'll keep using until it wears out and I need a new one. So on the back, I swapped out the Bontrager tire for a Maxxis Aggressor, 29 by 2.5 again, this time in the double down. And it's a dual compound tire, of course, as all Aggressors are. So that's just my favorite rear tire, especially for the conditions I ride in. Of course, it's an XT drivetrain. I've been running Eagle for most of the last few years, and I've really liked Eagle. Shimano, also good. In terms of tire pressure, I am running 22 PSI in the front, 25 in the rear, and that has worked really, really well for me. All right, if you've made it this far in the video, you're probably wondering what my thoughts are on this bike. And I gotta say, it works really well for me. So let's start off with the things you might think would be kind of a downside for this bike, and that would be climbing and flatter and gentler terrain. And honestly, this bike is as good, if not better, than my Fuel in most of those situations. The Fuel is a little bit more efficient if you're like hammering on a flat or flat-ish cross-country trail. You're going to start to notice the fact that this thing has a bigger fork. But in Strava times and in just general comfort, my climbing times have been really close, if not better, than my Fuel. Flat roads are just as comfortable, if not more comfortable, because the bars are a little bit higher, the seat tube is a little bit steeper, and the lockout on the shock, I would say, works really well. It's really supportive, and even when it's unlocked, it's actually pedals really well. In terms of being an all-around trail bike, it's not going to let you down in the more gentle stuff. Of course, if I were to compare this to my Krampus is, I would say, decently more efficient on the climbs and definitely better on the flats. But it gets left behind, being a rigid bike as soon as you get into anything rough. So if you're comparing it to a full-on cross-country bike, obviously, but if you compare it to a modern trail bike, 130, 150-ish, this thing has really held its own, and for me has been a really good all-around machine. All right, so let's jump into the stuff that this thing was made for. Of course, downhill enduro stuff. I've been just absolutely obliterating a lot of my PRs on this bike by pretty significant margins. And I would say, if you were to put a pro on this bike and my Fuel and some of my bikes I've had in the past, their times would be a lot closer. I do think that this bike is genuinely faster on that stuff because it does have more travel, and so it does float so much better through the rocks than any bike I've ever had. But for me, the main reason, I'm not that great of a descender. I'm definitely not a pro. And because this thing has so much more capability, I feel a lot more confident. And so I'm pushing myself a little bit harder. And so it's been a big step up because you can come fast into something and you're not afraid that the bike can't handle it. It feels extremely stable. It feels like you can really punch through stuff. And it feels like when you put it on line that you can keep it there. That's not to say you can't change lines. This thing corners really, really well. It feels almost fairly nimble, I would say. It doesn't feel like a sluggish straight line bike. It definitely is pretty nimble, especially since I sized it down. Overall, I've been really impressed. Like I say, I'm not going to go over every single feature and do a full review, but hopefully that gives you guys an idea. I know it's really hard to get a hold of these things, so I hope if you guys are looking for a bike, you can find one, and look forward to more adventure videos on my channel because we're going to be doing a lot of trail adventures this summer. All right, guys, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below, and until then, we'll catch you next time.